under the governor's recently renewed emergency executive order, we're going to continue to hold our meetings virtually under Minnesota statutes 13D.021. And again, regrettably, we are not offering public comment due to our virtual format, but we encourage public to email at public.info@metc.state.mn.us. I think we've been pretty good at waving and virtually waving, and if all else, just speak up to recognize council members speaking, and please remember to introduce yourself for those who are dialing in and not seeing who we are. We've learned a lot about what we need to do alphabetically, what we can do just by looking at the screen, and I've been advised by Office of General Counsel that determining a quorum, I actually do have to have a roll call. So welcome. And Liz, I know you're there somewhere.
Yes.
Let's start by calling the roll.
Okay. Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson.
Here.
Barber.
Here.
Chambliss.
Here.
Cummings.
Here.
Ferguson. Ferguson. Fredson. Fredson. Gonzalez.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Lee. Lilligren.
Here.
Lindstrom.
Here.
Musset.
Here.
Sterner.
Here.
Vento.
Here.
Wolf.
Here.
Zurin.
Here. I'm here.
Terzelli.
Here. Thanks, everyone. We have a quorum. And the first order of business is approval of the agenda, which I have also been advised we do not need a roll call unless there's an objection or any corrections or additions. Are there any corrections, additions, discussion of the agenda? Hearing none, it is approved. On to the approval of the minutes. The minutes from July 22nd, 2020. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved by Gonzalez.
Second.
Seconds.
Thank you. Any discussion? All right. Hearing none, Liz, please call the roll.
Atlas Ingebretson.
Aye.
Barber.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Ferguson.
Aye.
Fredson. Gonzalez.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom.
Aye.
Musset.
Aye.
Sterner.
Aye.
Vento. Aye. Wolf.
Aye.
Zurin.
Aye.
And Terzelli.
Aye. That motion carried. Now we're on to the consent agenda. There's a pretty full agenda, and it's there for everybody to look at. May I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I'll move the consent agenda, Mr. Chair. Lindstrom.
Thank you, Councilmember Lindstrom. Is there a second?
Second by Barber.
Thank you, Deb. Any discussion? Hearing none.
Atlas Ingebretson.
Aye.
Barber.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Ferguson,
Aye.
Fredson, Gonzalez,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Lee, Lilligren,
Aye.
Lindstrom,
Aye.
Musse,
Aye.
Sterner,
Aye.
Bento,
Aye.
Wolf,
Aye.
Zurin,
Aye.
Chair Zelli.
Aye. That consent agenda is carried. Approval is carried. We're now on to reports of the standing committees. Community Development has reports on the consent agenda. Environment Committee has reports on the consent agenda. And Management Committee has reports on the consent agenda. And the Transportation Committee has reports on the consent agenda. There is, however, a joint report to act on of the Environment and Community Development Committees, and due to the instability of esteemed Council Member Lilligren's computer, I'm going to call on Council Member Lindstrom.
I'm a pretty poor substitute for Mr. Lilligren, but I'll do my best here.
Tall order.
Tall order. Business item 2020-208 is Chaska's 2040 comp plan and comprehensive sewer plan. And Mr. Chair, this item is to authorize their comp plan. Because the city is connected to the regional wastewater system, this item was heard in both the Community Development and Environment Committees. Chaska, as we all are aware, is located in eastern Carver County. It's expected to add just under 10,000 people and about 4,000 households between now and 2040. The city is also forecasted to grow by another 4,000 jobs in that same time frame. With this plan, the city proposes to have both population and employment to be fully sewer serviced by 2040. Council staff find that this sewer serviced forecast to be reasonable and not cause a system impact. Staff found that the 2040 plan conforms to regional system plans, is consistent, and is compatible with the plans of adjacent and affected jurisdictions. Mr. Chair, I move that the Met Council adopt the attached advisory comments and review record and take the following actions. Authorize the City of Chaska to place its 2040 comp plan into effect. Revise the city's sewer serviced forecasts upward as shown in Table 2 of the attached review record. And advise the city to provide the dates that the watersheds approved the LWMP, the date the city adopted the final LWMP, and a copy of the final LWMP. If it differs from the version dated April 2020 and was submitted with the updated plan. And I should know this, but what does LWMP stand for? We try to make a point of not giving these acronyms. Anybody out there?
Anybody can answer that?
Mr. Chair, council members.
Watershed Management Plan? Yep, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, council members, can you hear me?
Yes. Thank
This is
you.
Sabarajas,
Lisa.
Community Development Director. I apologize for the acronym in there. That is LWMP's Local Water Management Plan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
And then finally, Mr. Chair, the recommendation from the Environment Committee is that we approve the comprehensive sewer plan.
Great. Before I call for a second, I just want to remind everybody to mute their phone if they're not speaking. And I'm looking around, and it might be Bob D. I hate to say this, but if you wouldn't mind muting your phone, there you go. Is there a second to the report?
Second by Barber.
Second. Oh,
Thank you, Councilmember Lilligren and Barber. Any discussion? If not, Liz, call the roll.
Atlas Ingebrigtsen,
Aye.
Barber,
Aye.
Chambliss,
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Ferguson,
Aye.
Gonzalez,
aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Lilligren,
Aye.
Lindstrom,
Aye.
Musset,
Aye.
Sterner, Sterner,
Aye.
Vento,
Aye.
Wolf,
Aye.
Zurin,
Aye.
Chair Zali.
Aye. I think this motion has carried. Thank you all. On to other business, and we have two very important items, and I want to acknowledge that we have a few guests in the room. Amanda Taylor and Peter Frost from the Greater MSP. I'm not sure if we have a member from the Economic Center for Economic Inclusion, but
Do.
I know we do. Lovely. But I want to welcome Michael Larson. This is obviously not the first time we've discussed the Regional Economic Framework, but we have had the date August 12th on the calendar for some time, and a lot of work leading up to this adoption. I will also say, as a way to frame the conversation, that this is not the end of our work. This is the beginning of our real work. So congratulations to everyone who's brought it up to this point. Michael, your microphone is working. I know, because we tested it.
Yay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, council members, Mr. Chair. My name is Michael Larson. I'm a senior planner in the Community Development Division. Before you now is the proposed adoption of the Regional Economic Framework. My presentation today includes a brief overview of what the framework is. You've had a more extensive review in the recent past. I'm going to include a review of the process that we've used to develop the framework, an overview of how we've responded to the feedback and suggestions that we've gotten during the public comment period, and then our findings and proposed actions for your consideration today. Next slide, please. So as you know, the Regional Economic Framework was developed as a partnership, as a public-private partnership with the Center for Economic Inclusion in Greater MSP. The framework serves as a comprehensive economic development strategy equivalent alternative. That's a rather long phraseology. This is an eligibility requirement, as we've explained, for entities in the region, including cities, counties, tribal governments, higher educational institutions, and other government entities to qualify for grants from the U.S. Economic Development Administration. These funds include an appropriation through the CARES Act for the EDA's Economic Adjustment Assistance and Public Works programs. The framework includes an analysis by partner staff of the region's economy, including its strengths, weaknesses, its opportunities, and its threats. The framework's 9 strategic priorities are based on the previous and extensive work of Greater MSP, including considerable past and current involvement by regional stakeholders. Articulation of the strategies has been informed by and is consistent with the Council's regional plans, policies, programs, and research. The framework is an articulation of Thrive's outcomes, especially around those around prosperity and equity. The image you've seen on the right, as you've seen previously, represents the entire metropolitan statistical area, and the 7-county area in blue will be the area that is newly covered by this SEDS equivalent alternative. Next slide, please. briefly, I'll just review the 9 strategic priorities. I'll just list them: regional brand and image, racial inclusion, workforce and skills, job growth, talent migration and retention, startups and innovation, new climate economy, transportation and mobility, and affordability. Next slide, please. I'm going to briefly go through our timeline and process. Dialogue about this, developing this SEDS equivalent alternative began with Greater MSP late last year. These discussions also included the preparation and including a partnership with the Brookings Institution to develop an economic value atlas, which is work that we intend to start in the near future. The urgency, as you know, to develop this framework began with the first of one, but 2 unprecedented events, both locally and in our country and around the world. The COVID-19 pandemic created a sense of urgency for both Greater Metropolitan Council and Greater MSP to quickly develop this framework to provide access to potential funds for programs and projects that could assist the region's communities. In April, Greater MSP staff and I briefed the Council's Executive Committee about this work and our proposed approach. In the weeks that followed, we engaged, in particular Greater MSP, reached out to economic development staff in the region, county commissioners on the Greater MSP board, the Regional Council of Mayors, and others. In May, we provided our first full briefing to the full council for the orienting you to this work. And shortly thereafter, we identified the need to include the Center for Economic Inclusion as a third partner. As you know, the second major event that we faced during the development of this framework was the killing of George Floyd, which was, I think, to all of us, an incredibly painful and overwhelming reminder of economic and social injustices that people experience, including how systemic racism impacts and threatens the social, economic, and physical well-being of our region's residents. With the support of the Center for Economic Inclusion, work in June on the framework began to take on much more direct work on integrating with regard to racial inequities through the priorities. We completed and distributed the draft for public review on July 10th. And we provided an overview to you of the draft on July 15th. We also met with the Council's Equity Advisory Committee on July 21st, and we did receive extensive comments from them that are included in the public comment report. Hopefully you've had a chance to review those. Each of the partners reached out to our contacts and networks to encourage the review and feedback, and that feedback and our responses are included in the public comment report. Now I'm going to share high-level, next slide please. I'm going to share some high-level highlights of how this feedback has impacted the document. We found that the comments were very insightful and thoughtful and appreciated them, and the partners worked together to address them. First of all, I'll go through the general comments. Really, we provided some additional clarity on roles and authority with respect to the framework, and particularly added some references to the important and fundamental roles that cities and counties play. We also reiterated our commitment to support meaningful, ongoing, and future public engagement. This recognizing that we developed this framework rather quickly, relying a lot on engagement that has gone on in the past. And we continue, we have a shared commitment to continuing engagement as we evaluate and implement the framework. Regarding development, demographics and socioeconomics, we strengthened the language on systemic racism. We also added new language acknowledging the calls of BIPOC organization for systemic change. In regard to the overview of the economy, we added additional language on the council's work related to racism and bias. Next slide, please. With regard to the section of the framework on mixed effectiveness of workforce development, we added additional language regarding differences in perceptions on workplaces, and I should clarify that is about the perceptions of of an inclusive workplaces, the differences in perceptions between employers and employees. With regard to the recovery framework, we responded to a desire to have a better acknowledgement of the variety and scales of groups and organizations, including community-based organizations that are involved in providing assistance and to communities and working at scale, at a community scale, to provide support and respond and adapt to the pandemic. And we responded, we provided additional clarity of the role of the framework regarding the ongoing crisis response planning that others are doing. This framework isn't intended to replace this sort of immediate, again, just responding to the immediate crisis that we're experiencing. With respect to regional brand and image, we changed some language, we added some language to really differentiate between brand and our region's image. And I think as you review the changes in the public comment report, you'll understand why that is the case. We did language edits related to what BIPOC residents are experiencing rather than using the language perception. We included also new references to cities and counties and the roles that they play with regard to regional brand. Next slide, please. With regard to racial inclusion, we included new language of references to BIPOC entrepreneurs, and language regarding the role of unconscious bias. We have a new measurement related to hiring of BIPOC employees and whether or not companies are hiring with respect to the racial and ethnic composition of the region. And we provided, I think, an important clarification that BIPOC communities, regardless of income, are more vulnerable to economic shocks. The previous language referred to low-income individuals, and it's important finding that BIPOC communities, regardless of income, are more vulnerable to recessions. And new language regarding the feeling of safety among members of BIPOC communities, in addition to just a sense of belonging. Next slide, please. With regard to workforce and skills, we made substantial edits to this area. And I want to thank Andrea Furston from the Center for Economic Inclusion and her experience with workforce development planning and issues. We have some more specifics regarding digital learning, commitments by employers to develop the workforce, the role of that individual and family safety nets can play to ensure that that workforce development is not interrupted by these kinds of other household or personal crises, and a reference to what we refer to as universal career navigation services. So career paths are clear to individuals who engage the workforce development system. And we made some edits to individual partners that would be involved. Next slide, please. What's related to job growth, we included a reference to the importance of site certification. That's a reference to redevelopment. New emphasis on growth from the expansion of existing businesses. And we made it an addition related to the evaluation of tax regulatory incentive tools and their effectiveness. With regard to talent and migration and retention, we included new language regarding education received abroad. That was an important issue that came up a number of times, that foreign immigrants often have specific barriers, so we addressed that more robustly. In additional, we identified additional implementation partners, particularly the roles of cities, counties, and NGOs. We were a little light touch on cities and counties, so we wanted to acknowledge the roles that they play. And with regard, next slide, please. With regard to startups and innovation, we had, I don't know if you're familiar with these programs, Business of Business, Business for Business, MSP, and CEO Next, but those are related to mentoring. A new action item, reducing barriers to BIPOC small business creation and growth. With regard to transportation and mobility, we added measures related to low, moderate income access to high frequency transit, travel time, and broadband access differentiated by race. And we added references again to the roles that cities and counties play in transportation, such as the Transportation Advisory Board and the Technical Advisory Committee to the tab. Next slide, please. With respect to affordability, we added an action item specifically for deep levels of affordability, an action item related to the roles of cities and counties again, language related to discrimination and bias in housing rentals and sales, and new references to the role that housing and tenant advocacy organizations can play with regard to this strategic priority. So that concludes my review of the public comments and our responses to the public comments, how it affects the document. So I'd like to move on to next slide, please. The findings for you today are as follows for this action item. That the Regional Economic Framework supports and is consistent with Thrive MSP 2040 and the region's system plans and policies. That the framework further articulates the themes around economic competitiveness contained in Thrive. That the framework addresses the Thrive outcomes of stewardship, prosperity, equity, livability, and sustainability. And that the framework integrates racial equity into each of the nine economic strategic priorities for the region. Next slide, please. There are 6 proposed action items for you today. Is to accept the attached public comment report and adopt the revised final draft of the Regional Economic Framework. The second is to commit to an ongoing partnership with the Center for Economic Inclusion and the Minneapolis-St. Paul Economic Development Partnership, otherwise known as Greater MSP, regarding the implementation, monitoring, and future updates to the framework. Third, to direct council staff to engage the Equity Advisory Committee on an ongoing basis with regard to implementation of and future revisions or amendments to the framework. And next slide, please. The fourth proposed action is to direct council staff to help ensure that the collaboration among regional stakeholders, that collaboration among regional stakeholders occurs whenever organizations utilize the Regional Economic Framework to develop programs or to solicit funds. The fifth is to request that staff from each of the partner organizations prepare a joint quarterly report on the implementation of the 9 strategic priorities identified in the framework, including the use of EDA funds awarded to entities in the region. And 6, final action is to use the Regional Economic Framework to guide technical assistance to local governments and other entities throughout the region. Next slide, please. So before I conclude, as you had mentioned earlier, leadership and staff from the partner organizations are here. I've introduced many of them previously, but I will also want to acknowledge the presence of Peter Frosch, CEO of Greater MSP, and Tawana Black, CEO of the Center for Economic Inclusion. And I want to personally express my appreciation for this new partnership and the new professional relationships that we've developed during this very difficult and unprecedented time for our region, our local communities, our region, our nation, and our world. It's been a rewarding, I think, engagement, and I look forward to continuing working with them. And I also want to make sure that I express my appreciation for all of the staff at the council that have assisted this effort, and I continue to be impressed by their knowledge and wisdom about a variety of issues of importance to the region. So thank you. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, and I may certainly pull in our partners as well to assist me. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Michael. Well, before we go into discussion, I would invite a motion to accept the public comment report, adopt the Regional Economic Framework, and to adopt the actions as just recently articulated.
Mr. Chair, Johnson moves.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. Is there a second?
Lilligren seconds.
Thank you, Robert. And I want to open it up, but also echo Michael's appreciation of our partners. And I now see Tawana and Andrea and Peter and Amanda there, and who are also able to join our staff in any questions or comments or thoughts you all have at this point.
Good afternoon, Chair Zelli, Tawana Black, founder and CEO of the Center for Economic Inclusion. Hats off and many applause to Michael, Lisa, the entire Met Council team for their leadership and stewardship of this project, and for the real expedient work of being able to take all of the public comments and partnership comments and feed them into preparation today and for the presentation, but also to Andrea and Amanda for their partnership on behalf of our teams and being able to lead us to this point. I certainly feel good about where we are, and yet know that a plan is a plan, and it takes the implementation work to really get us to where the regional economic framework, the aspirations that are embodied there. And what I would stress, I think, and Michael hinted at this, is the hope that folks got to spend time with the comments that were submitted by both the public as well as certainly our city and county partners throughout the region, the Equity Advisory Council, who provided great insight and recommendations to this process, and many others, because I think that they really do double down on the very comments that I offered to the council in first bringing us to this table, that it is not okay for us to engage some very early and others very late. It isn't okay for us to ignore data that we have before us as we craft things. But we must take the very best of insight and intel that we can and honor that as we craft strategies, and we must be very intentional about that. And sometimes that means slowing down in order to go fast later, and sometimes it means calling an all-out pause. But if that's what it takes in order for us to get drastically different results than we've ever been able to get in our region before, then that's what it's going to take. And so hats off to all of those folks across our region who were willing to read through this document with a fine-tooth comb and give us great feedback and insight. Hats off to them when they disagreed and when they agreed. And hopefully we're all in it to do this work arm in arm, because it's going to take a lot of time together to really craft a region that truly does work for all of us by centering Black, Indigenous, and people of color and the economic outcomes that will drive our entire economy forward.
Thank you so much for that comment. Anybody else?
I add my thanks to the team at Met Council, to Center for Economic Inclusion, and call out Amanda from our team. So much work, such a short period of time. I think we did a lot of new things in a fairly short period of time, and it's pretty difficult circumstances. And what we're looking at now is a conversation that really starts bridging economic development and community development in a way that we haven't done in this region before, in a way that's really, really important. And so we've started a lot of things that we can now continue to work on together.
Thank you, Peter. I will say, you know, when you think about our aspirations and goals, that we know it's not going to be a straight line. And though this is a moment of celebration, to be open to feeling uncomfortable, to open to taking a few zigzags, open to doing the hard work, and to know that we need to be here in the years ahead, all of us, looking back saying, you know, we made progress, and knowing that that is not easily done. So devil's in the details, and there's a lot of good details here to follow up on. Any other discussion before I call for a vote?
Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank my fellow colleagues on the council. In every committee meeting that I've been in these recent months, and especially as this was moving through the process for public comment, and really thank you to Tawana and Center for Economic Inclusion for calling it out that we need to make sure the process brings everybody in at the right time, and we need to slow it down. We do, and holding each other accountable is a good thing. And so there will be a lot of that in this process, and I'm looking forward to it. So I just want to thank everybody for their great intentions, and I'm excited to get, you know, one step further in the process and be very supportive in this. And then I just can't help myself because I write a lot. On page 2, we refer BIPOC, but maybe we should, instead of saying Black, Indigenous, people of color in the parentheses, switch that around so that it matches our acronym and how we explain it elsewhere. So we would spell it out and then put BIPOC in parentheses and then continue to use BIPOC going forward. That was my one thing I noticed. And I really appreciate, I have to tell you, the edits that came through from the feedback were great, because I know many council members too, again, as we've just been discussing this various work in our other committees, have been really wanting that reflected in this piece. So thank you.
With no disagreement, I think we will include that correction in the report. And just to follow up on the comment of appreciation, I really do appreciate, and I think we all do, the hard work of our council and our Met Council staff. You know, this took a lot of eyeballs, and I think another really important point is it brought out, especially by the Equity Advisory Committee, that not everything we're doing is in this regional framework. We are building on our next Thrive regional plan. We're starting our work with the Economic Value Atlas with Brookings. We've got everything that we talk a lot about to be laid out now in more actionable items. So this is really an important step, but it's not the only step. So having said that, are you ready to vote? All right, Liz, please call the roll.
Atlas Ingebretson. Atlas Ingebretson.
Aye.
Barber.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Resounding aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Ferguson.
Aye.
Gonzalez.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom.
Aye.
Musset.
Aye.
Sterner.
Aye.
Bento.
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Zurin.
Aye.
And Chair Zelli.
Aye. That motion carried. Thank you again, everybody, and congratulations.
Thank you all.
And Michael, well done. Your microphone, it just catches everything.
Thank you.
Our final item on the agenda is an information item on a preliminary 2021 operating budget and levies to be presented by Mary Bogey and staff. I will say, even before she starts, that when we say preliminary, it is preliminary. There seems to be a lot of moving targets here, but knowing and keeping our eyes open to some of these trends and starting this process or continuing this process now is really, really important for us to focus on. So, Mary?
Mr. Chair and council members, I am actually going to turn the conversation over to our acting chief financial officer. Marie is going to start us off with the presentation. But you gave a very good introduction in that we're kind of at that first step in budget and seeing the budget in whole cloth today. And so the uncertainty of COVID has definitely made this budget a challenge. It will continue to be a challenge through 2020, and we're going to learn a lot along the way between beginning this budget and finally adopting it. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Marie.
Thank you, Mary. So good afternoon, council members. Like Mary said, my name is Marie Henderson, and I am the acting chief financial officer for the council. Today, we are before the council to present the preliminary 2021 operating budget and levy. And I'm going to apologize in advance. This is a very long presentation, but it is also a very important one. So we'll flip to the next slide. While there's been discussion at the committees about the division level budget, tonight is your first opportunity to see and hear the proposed operating budget as a whole. The preliminary budget is not the end of our budget cycle, and it is just the step along the way. In particular, this year, with the pandemic, we anticipate there may be significant changes between this preliminary budget that we will be adopting August 26th meeting and the final budget on December 9th. As we continue to get more data and revise our estimate of the impact of this pandemic. We do have 2 statutory deadlines that are highlighted in red on this slide in the budget development timeline. The budget we're proposing today will ask you to adopt on August 26th. This establishes an upper limit on our property tax levy. After September 1st, the council may lower but not raise the total levy amount. Metro area counties will consider our levy amount in establishing their own budgets and tax levies and will mail out the truth in taxation notices to property owners showing the proposed amount of property taxes from all taxing jurisdictions. As we move along our budget development timeline through the public comment draft and to final adoption of our budget in December, we can and historically have adjusted our operating budget. However, we cannot make budgetary changes to what would increase our levy. Our primary focus today will be on the operating budget, which is operations, pass-through, debt service, and other post-employment benefits, and our property tax levy. In October, after discussion with the committee level, we will come back to highlight the capital program, consisting of authorized projects, 6-year plan, and proposed spending in 2021. We'll go to the next slide, please. Council members, we refer to the preliminary operating budget presented today as the regional administrator's recommended budget as required by statute to be submitted by the council for approval. Ultimately, we will go through public comment and final adoption, and this is what becomes the council's budget. Next slide, please. Levy authority. I'm going to kick off our presentation today with a discussion of the council's property tax levies. The council has authority in state statute to levy a property tax in the metro area for specific purposes to fund our grant and loan programs, debt service obligations, and in a limited way, our general purposes. Our non-debt service levies increase each year in accordance to the measurement of government inflation. This is called the implicit price deflator. And over the past 10 years, the average increase of this inflator is about 2%, although we've seen years that are less than 1% growth. For 2021, the increase is actually 2.9%. Our debt service levies are not limited by this inflation rate, but for transit and parks are effectively limited by the statutory authority granted to us to issue debt. Our wastewater debt is secured primarily through wastewater fees, but secondary by the full faith and credit of the council, though we've never needed to levy for wastewater debt services. Our levies are shared across the 7-county metro area, except the transit debt service levy, which is shared by a smaller area serviced by our transit service. This is considered the transit capital levy communities, We have a slide later on to show you that map. So next slide, please. Our levy strategy has some givens in it. We need to make our debt service needs for parks and transit. And we receive $5 million annually from the Fiscal Disparity Fund to the Tax Base Revitalization Account. We based our decisions on this following strategy. We have held the total levy increase to 2% annually. This year, given the pandemic and the financial challenges facing our communities and citizens, we are proposing a 0% increase in total. Though our livable communities and general purpose levies have limited growth in statute, we propose to continue to maximize those levies. They will be used to support the TOD, which is the Transit Operating Development Component within the Livable Communities Demonstration Account grant program, and to provide flexibility to fund targeted priority initiatives of the council. Finally, we continue to have significant funds in our highway right-of-way program and therefore not needed to levy for that purpose. So let's go to the next slide and show you the chart and how this breaks out the proposed 2021 property tax levy. Like I said, the total proposed levy is a 0% increase from 2020 and remains at $88.7 million. A few things to note on this slide. First, but for the highway right-of-way program, our non-debt service levies are at their statutory maximum. Since we are proposing to hold our levy at 0%, the difference will fall to our debt service levies. Second, unlike other municipal entities, the council's general purpose levy at $16.1 million funds less than 2% of our operations. And finally, the parks debt service levy returned this year as we issued $8.8 million in parks GO bonds in May of this year. So the next slide, I talked about a little bit earlier about the map of where our area is in the transit taxing area. The 7-county metro area, and if we go counterclockwise, there minus the Hanover, Rockford, New Prague, and Northfield, in that blue area and in that red area, which was added, is considered our transit taxing district. This was established by state statute. And we'll go to the next slide. We do have some debt service pressures, in particular from transit, that impact the sustainability of our overall levy strategy into the future. Primary use of our regional transit bonding is for fleet replacement, and we have successfully, with the legislator, in gaining an increase of our annual bonding authority that reflects a 4.5% inflation on those bus replacements. It's a big deal for our capital program, but it places pressure on levy needed to repay the debt and our desire to historically stay within the 2% growth, and in this year, having that 0% growth. These pressures would indicate a need for higher annual growth in our total levy, but historically, we've been able to manage within that 2% because of the highway right-of-way program and park debt services not having provided a lot of pressure on that levy. However, lowering to a 0% is an appropriate approach this year. It may not be a sustainable approach in future years, And while the pandemic may impact our capital program as well, it's likely we will see additional pressures in our levy strategy as transit debt service consumes a larger portion of the overall levy. The next slide, please. Our livable community levies fund grant programs administered in community development. The tax base revitalization account levy is dedicated to the cleanup of polluted land. The livable community demonstration account levy is proposed at the levy limit. Again, with the goal to accommodate the $5 million for transit-oriented development component within the grant program. The local housing initiative account receives statutory transfers from the LCDA, which is the Livable Community Demonstration Account, and the general purpose levies to fund grants to municipalities to help meet their affordable and life cycle housing goals. Next slide, please. And finally, we have our general purpose levy proposed at $16.1 million, which is the maximum amount for 2021. The general purpose levy is, of course, the favorite levy because we have a broad and flexible funding use within the council's statutory responsibility. Keeping in mind, this is only about 2% of our total operations. We do have some primary funding responsibilities for the general purpose levy, which includes funding the operations, primarily for community development of $11.2 million, and $1 million statutory transfer to the local housing incentive account. Historically, the general purpose levy also funded portion of regional administration, but regional administration is now fully allocated to the divisions, which I'll explain later on. Targeted initiatives are intended to fund council's priority initiatives. Because of pressures on our overall levy, we discussed earlier, targeted initiatives are one-time uses, or a pilot program, or a bridge to another funding source. The general purpose levy will have $3.9 million available to fund the council's targeted initiatives in this budget. Last year and in previous years, the division directors recommended targeted initiatives for the proposed budget. This year, we started with the discussion with the management committee. Next slide. And this was the result. The management committee proposes spending $3.9 million to advance equity in the region by focusing on the four goals that were established in the council member retreat: support for housing security, transportation, climate sustainability, and housing affordability. As we progress from preliminary to final budget, we will add more details in the development of actionable initiatives around the use of the $3.9 million in advancing equity in the region. Next slide, please. So what's the impact of the taxpayer with the levy that we are proposing? In this example, just using a $250,000 home value, and of course, all things being equal year over year, kind of those caveats that if a homeowner resides within the transit taxing community, they would pay around $49.42. This is actually a flat increase from last year. And outside the transit taxing communities, they'd pay $16.63, again, roughly. It's a 1.43 increase from last year, but that's due to the park debit levy that we did not have in the prior year. As we know, not all things are equal year over year, and individual taxpayers will have different experiences depending upon factors like increasing home values. Next slide, please. The council has been good stewards of its levy. Putting our levy in context with other metro area taxing jurisdictions, the council has a declining share of the revenue from property taxes paid by metro area residents and receives about 1.4% of those revenues. And I'm just going to pause here and ask the council proposed tax levy if there's any questions before we move on to the operating budget. Okay, so next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So we're going to start with the overall look of our operating budget and following up with drilling into each division's budget. The 2021 proposed operating budget is $1.2 billion, and this represents a $6 million decrease over the adopted 2020 budget. This decrease is COVID pandemic related and primarily driven by impacts to our transit services. This, along with the extensive use of one-time funds in our transportation budget, is a key budget message you will hear more about later on in this presentation. This slide notes the breakouts between the operations, pass-through, debt service, and other post-employment benefit corresponding to last year's adopted budget. Our OPEB fund, which is our other post-employment benefits, reflects our fully funded status of our retiree health care liability and the earnings on the OPEB fund balance to pay retirees medical premiums. For 2020, OPEB is expected for the reserve balance to remain neutral, and we will continue to watch this fund closely. Pass-through fundings is relatively stable year over year, and changes primarily reflect timing of the drawdown and distribution of grant funds as communities complete their projects. We've already talked about the debt service pressures as they relate to property tax levy, and Lisa will speak in more detail about debt service pressures in the environmental services budget. The operations expense of $790 million year over year. So on the right side of this chart, we burst out year over year changes for the operating category, and this represents a $7 million decrease year over year from the adopted budget. That's almost a 1% decrease in overall operations. As we break this out by category, salaries and benefits represent about 61% of our operating budget. The increase this year is $3 million over the adopted 2020 budget. A $3 million increase also is in contracted services, and this relates to our transit provider contracts and technologies related to hardware and software maintenance. This is all offset by a $13 million decrease, which again can be attributed to COVID and pandemic impacts on our transit service assumptions that you will hear about shortly. Next slide, please. These pie charts show the uses and sources of our operating budget. The left side pie chart shows the budget breakout by division. The RA, again, budget is mostly allocated and reflected in the division's budget. The biggest story is this budget is on the pie chart on the right-hand side regarding the sources of funding in the budget, which will be significantly impacted by the pandemic. So first, note that the fair revenue is a forecast of $44.7 million. This is a reduction of $68 million, or 60% from the adopted 2020 budget. Also note that the motor vehicle sales tax is forecasted at $284 million. This is a reduction of $38 million from the adopted 2020 budget. This budget is consistent with the forecast that MMB did in May in response to the pandemic for the state fiscal year 2021. MMB did not revise their forecast for the state fiscal year 2020, so the budget extended that May forecast for another 6 months. We will adjust the budget prior to the final adoption to reflect the November forecast. These funding reductions are offset primarily by the federal government. The federal government contributes to our operating budget primarily through our HRA pass-through activities, but also includes federal revenues for preventative maintenance in transportation and the Federal CARES Act funding. The federal government contributes $179 million to our operating budget. This is an increase of $72 million. There will be more details describing this change when we come to the transportation portion tonight by Nick and Wes and Heather and Ed. Our property taxes support about 8% of our operating budget. But as you saw in previous slides, primarily this funds our debt service and grant programs. This only supports about 2% of our operations. The other is primarily investment income mainly within our OPEB plan assets. We have planned the use of our reserves primarily in transportation of $56 million, and we'll talk more about that again in the divisions when they present. Next slide, please. The general fund. I've given you the overall picture of our proposed budget and now plan to shift gears into the divisional level budgets, starting with the general fund. At the council, we use our general fund to account for activities in regional administration and community development. The sources of funding for the general fund, shown here in the middle of the slide, are primarily RA costs allocated to operational divisions and our general purpose property tax levy, which funding primarily for community development and IT. Equity initiatives and statutory transfers funded by the general purpose levy make up the remainder. On the expense side, salaries and benefits represent about 60% of our operating budget. Next slide. For each of our operating funds, the council has established reserve targets. For the general fund, that reserve target is 10% of operating expenses before the one-time initiatives. Our reserve target for 2021 is $8.3 million, and the projected year-end reserve is just over $10 million. The general fund reserve is above target. However, these funds are the most flexible, and small dollar amounts have been used in the past to bridge to other funding sources. Important to note that because the RA allocations are based on actual expenditures, the only time that we add to the general fund reserve is if community development comes in under budget. The next slide, please. The proposed regional administration budget for 2021 is $74.7 million. This is about a 5% increase and is due primarily to the increases in informational services for our hardware and software costs, increased at a rate higher than normal inflation, and transfers of expenses from the operating divisions to regional administration. Regional administration can be divided into 4 functional categories as illustrated in this chart. Just to remind you and go through each of these categories, administrative services includes management of the overall council decision-making process, internal review of council programs and finances, legal representation and relationships with other government agencies and the legislator. Within business services, that includes communications, the community relations, management of the council's records, retirement and retention, the recruitment and retention of employees. Financial services includes budgeting, accounting, and financial reporting, procurement, and management of council's risks. Information services providing computer services and geographical information services to council programs. Our budget is more than 60% salaries, and within contracted services includes our council-wide costs for hardware and software licensing and maintenance. Sources are mainly that the RA is allocated out to the divisions. The next slide. The final slide for me is that we are showing the RA allocation impact to the division budgets and is reflective of the services provided to divisions. Depending on the service area, the allocation method may be on head count, transaction counts, or systems. With that, next slide, please. I would like to turn the presentation now over to community development.
Good afternoon. My name is Heather Augustin-Hebner, the Finance Director for MTS. And I imagine Lisa is probably very actively trying to get herself on video. So if we could just pause for a second, and if she's unable to get in, I'm happy to jump in.
That's great, Heather. We can go to your part first.
Sounds good. So why don't we do this? There's 2 kind of introduction slides to the division, and we'll just maybe circle back on those, and we'll maybe have Lisa wrap that up at the end. So could you please go forward 2 slides? There we go. So as Marie mentioned, COVID is impacting budgets council-wide, and community development is no different. So there's just want to kind of give everybody an overview of how dynamic this situation is, and give you an understanding of what we know or what we think we know, because we've got pretty strong indications from our partners. So on the increasing side, we know that we're going to get additional HUD administration funds and voucher revenue. We have already brought in about $1 million into our budget amendment, and just found out a couple days ago that we're going to get another about $1.4 million in administrative fees. And we also know that we are going to get additional housing voucher funds later this year. That's really good news because expenses have increased in areas such as the average housing payments and the HRA and overhead expenses. We also have additional expenses related to the encampment where the state is reimbursing us. The other area that's increasing is COVID-19 related work. It's been a significant impact in areas ranging from the HRA staff to researchers to finance staff. This is an item that hasn't really increased our cost, but it has become a significant opportunity cost as many of our projects have had to be delayed and slowed. In the decreasing column, we know that our state fiscal year 21 legacy revenue is decreasing by about $2.6 million, and we've already dealt with that in one of our budget amendments on the capital side. Salary and benefit costs are modestly decreasing due to our soft hiring freeze. We're also closely monitoring consultant project work as many projects are delayed or slowed. And this has the potential to impact our 21 budget if some of our costs may need to be carried over. In a normal year, you'll see a few changes between our preliminary and public comment budgets. Staff are closely monitoring our financial situation, and given the uncertainty we see this year, you may see more movement in our budgets than you would in a typical year. So not surprisingly, we're keeping a really close eye on our revenue sources. I don't have a good deal to share right now, other than most revenues that impact the CD budget are holding fairly steady right now. Next slide, please. So our Metro HRA budget has a structural deficit. We are in a very similar place as we were last year, except that we have the additional stressors of COVID impacting our budget. Right now, we're experiencing historic increases in rental costs. Rental costs are outpacing our federal revenue, and our federal revenue always lags by a year. For example, as a reminder, if we anticipate receiving 2021 federal funding we're going to expect for our 21 budget that we are going to get what our 2020 costs are. So we're always a year behind. Compounding our issues this year are the rising unemployment rates due to COVID, and that's really impacting families' abilities to pay for their share of the rent. So as they earn less, they're able to pay less, and the council's share is more, and that has increased costs. Next slide, please. So there's a lot we don't know, but we're going to do a deeper dive this fall. Kind of our bottom line is that the council's HRA can't lease to all the possible families within our current federal funding levels. This is really caused by rising housing costs, and the economic downturn, like I mentioned on the previous slide, is really worsening the problem. So we are going to need to be asking you all to wrestle with some really challenging conversations this fall. We're going to have to figure out what our program size is going to be. We're going to have to discuss what choice we're able to offer. What we don't know right now, or either don't have right yet, are the federal funding levels. Federal fair market rent analysis, we don't get that until the fall. And then we're going to come back to you and ask you to set rent standards, utility allowances, community choice, and program size. So I would just offer that the preliminary budget that you're looking at tonight, I would really consider it more of a placeholder budget, and we will come back to you with some really substantive conversations in kind of that October-ish timeframe, and the specific data that's going to be really dependent upon when we get the fair market rent values from the federal government. Next slide, please. So our proposed budget is when you take all of CD programs, including HRA as a whole, our budget's about $124 million. And that represents the operating and pass-through budget while maintaining current service levels. So I'm first going to walk you through the operations portion of our budget, and then we'll transition to the pass-through section. About 20% of our division budget is comprised of two primary operating areas. The blue section on the chart represents HRA administration. This is the budget that's comprised of staff salaries, RA allocations that you just heard Marie talk about. You know, we need an HR department, we need central finance, we need procurement, all of those functions. And then some modest contracted services, consulting, and smaller ticket items, things like printing and small office equipment. The orange section of the chart represents our finance, grants, livable communities, local planning, parks, and research unit. And it's really comprised of staff salaries. So the orange part is really kind of what we need to make all the programs run. And the green slice of the pie represents a statutorily required $1 million transfer to our LHIA pass-through programs. So really, when you look at this portion of the budget, it's staff salaries, it's consulting contracts that we use to do our work in the parks unit, in the research unit, and some of our other areas. We pay for the central services to make us go, and then just some basic overhead that a division needs to operate. Next slide, please. So this slide represents our revenue sources for the operations that we just talked about. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because Marie just went through it, but we're funded largely by property taxes, And the other, the 2.9 that you'll see in the other, that's mainly some state revenue for some housing programs. The federal portion is primarily used to fund our HRA administration staff, the folks that really operate and make the HRA program run. And then we have the $1 million statutory transfer that we talked about before. Next slide, please. So our division pass-through program is funded with federal, state, and local property taxes. The pass-through program represents about 80% of the total community development budget. We pass through funding in the form of housing payments, grants to park implementing agencies, livable communities grants, and planning assistance grants. So the council has varying levels of control over the programs. For example, the parks operating and maintenance pass-through program is directed by state statute, and the HRA is highly regulated by the federal government, but the council does have influence over rental limits and the administration plan on the HRA side, and the council has a really great deal of influence over the Livable Communities Pass-Through program through annual levy strategies and approval of the annual fund distribution plan. As a quick reminder, the fund distribution plan establishes the annual plan for distributing funds under the State Livable Communities Act and includes scoring criteria. Our division work is primarily funded, as I said before, with federal, state, and local funds. And with that, why don't we transition back to the first two slides and see if Lisa is able to connect. I know she was having some problems with Wi-Fi earlier. And if she's not on, I can just take these two slides also.
Mr. Chair, Heather, can you hear me?
Excellent.
Yes, welcome back.
Thank you. I apologize for that. My computer doesn't always like to agree with me, but thank you, Heather, for taking the reins while I reconnected here. So a quick overview, Heather captured a lot of this, but I know our community development committee members are familiar with this as we talk about what we're primarily responsible for in the Community Development Division. We do that coordination of planning and policy work to guide the region's growth and development. And we do that in a number of ways, both in our long-range planning efforts, which we will begin undertaking in 2021 in more earnest for the 2050 Regional Development Guide. We partner with regional park implementing agencies to plan for and fund the regional park system. We provide a whole lot of technical assistance, which Mike Larson had talked about as part of the REF that you just discussed today. We facilitate a lot of community collaboration around a number of different projects, whether it's local neighborhood scale kind of redevelopment or larger connection issues across the region. And as Heather discussed, we deliver a lot of state and federally funded rent assistance to create and provide affordable housing for low-income households. And then in our Livable Communities Act grants, provide and incentivize funding to help support the cleanup of polluted sites, bringing those properties back onto the tax rolls, expanding housing choices across the region, and really supporting the development of new neighborhoods and places that connect housing, jobs, and services across the region. And what you hear often from our division as well is the extensive amount of research that our staff does on issues of regional importance, on regional trends, on development trends and building, and even more deeply on the council's priorities, including how we consider equity and what sort of data we use to both measure what that looks like and how we track our progress in the region. Next slide, please. So on that topic, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we advance equity in community development. I know you had equity initiatives as part of your general fund dollars that Marie talked about. In community development, our work is really what our staff do. That is primarily a large part of that. And you'll see on this slide, which we recognize is maybe not the best way to visualize the way we do our work in community development. But we wanted to give this a start and certainly welcome your input on how we might better visualize this work for you. But this slide is really organized into two different areas. The green columns representing on the left dollars that are passed through to clients or other outside organizations. And then the blue columns on the right representing more of our in-house activities, what our staff do with all of their time in our annual work plans and how we move actions forward. So just as an example, Heather did talk about how we influence our HRA dollars and the choices that the council makes in setting the policies and rent standards, where we, the criteria we use for placing project-based vouchers, for example, that our committee, Community Development Committee recently reviewed and will be reviewing again this fall. And in our grant programs, especially in livable communities, where we are working on expanding housing choice, but also considering the impacts in community of developments that we're incentivizing, that are these promoting equitable outcomes for residents in these neighborhoods where development proposals are. We do that both in our strategies, but also in our scoring criteria. An example you see of that work, as well as in our regional parks grant programs, or equity grant program being probably the most obvious one, but also in moving some of our policies more upstream in our equity analysis requirements on the planning side of that. So you'll see that more on the blue columns than in the green columns. Really shaping the work that community development does happens in our annual work plan, which we'll begin discussing this fall and into in January of next year as well, finalizing that. Those strategic initiatives, but also turning the page and moving into our planning long-range efforts for the next regional development guide, which includes report out and what we saw in existing comprehensive plans now that you have been approving over the last couple of years, as well as where the council would like to go, and setting the stage for that work. And how we center our work and how we do that work is really how equity shows up. So I thank you for your time today and bearing with me as I was dealing with technology, and thank you to Heather for taking the reins in my absence. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Mr. Chair, council members, I guess we can take a quick pause. If you have any specific questions about the budget, I'm happy to answer those. Otherwise, we can certainly transition over to, I believe, environmental services is next.
Good afternoon.
Okay, thanks, Heather.
Good afternoon, council members. If you're ready, we'll move on with environmental services.
That'd be great. Thanks, Lisa.
Okay. I'm going to introduce us to environmental services budget, but I've asked Ned Smith, our Director of Finance and Revenue, to join me at the end to cover some more of the details of the budget. This slide is just a good reminder that we have three primary roles. We provide the wastewater services to our municipal and industrial customers, but we also provide planning and technical assistance for both surface water planning and water supply planning. So these three things are the outcomes of our efforts from environmental services. We protect the public health, we protect the environment, and we foster economical growth of the region. Next slide. This is our system. Probably a couple things that are really important to always remember is we have $7 billion of infrastructure throughout this region that provides us the capacity to serve the population of the region, which is almost 50% of the Minnesota population. We provide treatment services to 110 communities and 800 industries. And our relationship that we have with them is both customer and partner. We have a vision to be a valued leader and partner in water sustainability. And frankly, we couldn't be as efficient and effective at delivering the services that we do without those partnerships. Next slide. Well, we have a lot of money in our budget, and we hope to be doing good things with all that money. And we thought it would be good to just kind of cover a few highlights of how well we're doing. So we have service level categories of financial, health, safety, and environment, and customer service. And I'm going to start with our financial category, where we have 5 goals. We have charges and fees. And in 2018, we did a survey with those customers, and we found out that our customers, 69% of them thought that we were fairly priced, and only 4% were dissatisfied with our pricing. And I will point out for our 2021 budget that we have adjusted our budget in response to the pandemic and customer feedback. So you'll be seeing that in the budget that Ned will share with you here shortly. Other important things in our goals for this is to retain our AAA rating, which happily the bond rating was done in May, and we achieved a AAA rating again. We were also able to optimize our budget plan with an $80 million bond offering, and we received a 1.65% interest rate. Also, we are on track. Despite the pandemic, we are making full-on progress with our preservation of assets, which is a tribute to the efforts and the commitment of our staff to keep that going forward. And our last piece is to be fair and transparent. So typically our budget preparation includes a series of meetings with the communities out in the region where we get a chance to hear their feedback and questions and take that into account for our budget before we finalize it. Well, this year with the social distancing, we converted those to virtual meetings. And we were a little concerned about how that would turn out, but we actually had a record attendance and we got really good engagement. So that turned out to be very positive for us. Next slide. This category is our health, safety, and environment. And in a normal year, I would offer that this includes our highest priorities because it really is about the health and safety of our staff and other things too. But with the pandemic, that's even a higher emphasis. Our success with our permit compliance would not be possible without the commitment and excellence of our staff. And just like other organizations, the human crisis element is affecting our staff as well. But I'm happy to report that we're maintaining our compliance and the measures that we've established to prevent the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace have been effective to date. I will admit that staff are fatigued and we are constantly keeping an eye on and supporting our continued efforts and success here. About half of our staff are working on site and we have social distancing measures in place. We're doing temperature checks. We've installed plexiglass barriers. We've split crews who might travel to their work site or job site together. We've got them in separate vehicles. And we require masks for employees and contractors. We also have a thorough process for cleaning and contact tracing and a communication notification system when we have an employee with suspected or confirmed COVID-19. Those things are all working at the present, and we expect that we'll continue to be successful in meeting our permit and our service requirements. And I want to call your attention to a couple equity examples that we've consider part of our lead by example goal. Just to remind you, on July 8th, several ES staff presented an information item on our outreach workforce program. And we're especially proud of that program, not only for its success, but because it's a very collaborative effort. And the fact that on a national level, we are gaining lots of interest in terms of that program so others can learn from us how they can improve their programs. And then the last one is that we've recently started working with the Council's OEO division to examine wastewater affordability in our region with the idea that we will seek remedies where we have affordability issues that come up. Next slide. So this is one of my favorites. Looks like a layer cake, and I think that's fitting for this information as the results do warrant a celebration. And we often associate eating cake with celebrations and milestones. This reports our awards for our National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. It's an acronym you've probably heard before, NPDES. And that's our compliance, and it shows our compliance through the end of 2019. The NPDES permit program addresses water pollution by regulating point sources that discharge to the waters of the United States. This was created in '72 by the Clean Water Act, And this program is authorized to state governments by EPA, so we do our reporting to the Minnesota Pollution Control Association. The awards that are shown on this graph are presented by the National Association of Clean Water Associations, and it is representing across the nation facilities that have 5 or more years of continuous compliance. So we have 6 facilities, and their records are listed in the corresponding layer in our layer cake graphic. Just want to call your attention to the 2 top plants in terms of years, 28 and 29 years. There are only 2 plants with higher records in the country, 30 years for Ames, Iowa, and 31 years for Hanover, New Jersey. So we're right at the top with that one. It's pretty outstanding. Next slide. Our other category of customer levels of service is customer service. And I want to call your attention to a couple items there. The first is the engagement with our customers on our municipal wastewater charges, or the MWCs, as you'll see them referred to in our budget. Mostly that our budget plan took quite a bit of a turn in terms of getting the feedback from the customers and what we originally had planned or committed to. And Ned will explain more about that. The second is our collaboration on outdoor seating. So you might remember that when the governor issued the order to close restaurants to inside seating, but we're allowing them to have outdoor seating, that raised some questions for our restaurant community and our actual communities. We felt that we needed to have a system in place to let people know there was no SAC due. But we worked with our cities. We had about 16 cities that worked with us to figure out what's the best way to do that so it would be efficient and yet get the job done. And so they brainstormed and came up with a way to do it, and we proceeded with those recommendations. Now I will hand it off to Ned for a little bit more of a deeper dive on the details. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And I would point out the governor issued the order on a Wednesday, and we met with our cities on Thursday, and we had a policy, a quote unquote policy in place by Friday. So really appreciated the partnership with our cities to help us through that. Next slide, please. Okay, so first I want to dig in a little bit more to our financial level of service. Some of you might recall that for the last 3 years, we have had what we call the 4% promise, and 2021 was supposed to be the 4th year of our 4% promise, which is where we said we would keep our rates at increase to the MWCs at 4% or lower. Of course, remember that each city, their actual rate increase is dependent on the flows as well as that increase from the MWC, but it's helpful at a region-wide level that we do our best to control our expenses. And as we started the budget process in January and February, and even into March, we thought we were going to have about a 3.6% increase. And then the middle of March happened, and we realized that some cities might face 10 to 20% revenue shortfalls. So we wanted to be sensitive to that and be responsive to our customer concerns. So we cut 2% out of our increase, which was worth about $4 million. And when we shared that with our customers, they were enthusiastic about that approach. In fact, we reached out to several cities to kind of take their pulse and see how they were viewing finances, and all of them thought it was going to be tight, and they needed us to be fiscally responsible and show some fiscal austerity to help them manage through the crisis. So we did lower that down as a result of their concerns. How are we going to manage that? Well, mostly through optimizing our budget. We continue to work on facility teams to find opportunities to balance capital versus maintenance versus operations. Open a planning and scheduling office to make sure we are optimizing the work being done. Continue to look at energy opportunities and energy savings, including partnering with Excel on some innovative solutions, and then continue technology. The other thing we've been doing is working closely with Janine and Janine Clancy and the technical services team on using the capital program to kind of smooth out some of our large chunks of work, and to make sure that we're, as we put a capital plan together, we look out 10 to 15 years to see what the impact will be in our operating budget. And that's a good tool for us in the near term and the long term. Next slide, please. So at a high level, here's the executive summary. So municipal wastewater charge, MWC, up 2%, as we've discussed. That averages out to about $2.75 per year per residential equivalent. So a household, that 2% increase is a $2.75 increase for them. Our sewer availability charge has no change. It will still be $2,485 per SAC unit, and that has not increased since January 1st of 2014. The transfer then will be about $57.5 million, and that includes $7.5 million from the SAC reserve for PAYGO, which is one of the ways that we are working to through that lower rate increase. PAYGO is pay as you go, which is where you use operating funds to pay where a project that otherwise would have been capitalized. And then our industrial waste strength charge and our industrial waste permit fees, those pretty much move in lockstep with our MWC increase. So those are right around 2%. Next slide, please. So in addition to being a modest $2.75 increase, it also per year per residential equivalent, it also keeps us very competitive relative to our peer agencies. NACWA, as Lisa mentioned earlier, the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, does a survey every few years to understand what the national retail rates are for sewer charges. And then we at MCS every 2 years go out and survey our customers. We just wrapped ours up for 2020 to see what their retail rate is. And that's where we ask the cities, or we work with the cities to figure out what would the monthly fee be for a 5,000 gallon per month household. And we figure out what the total retail charge is. So that includes our wholesale fee for the water treatment and conveyance, but also whatever local charges the municipality puts for their maintenance of their infrastructure and operations of their infrastructure. So when we see $347 per year retail rate for Twin Cities region, MCES represents about 55 to 65% of that charge, depending on which city you're in. But all of that puts us at, again, 40% less than our peer agencies. Peer agencies being an agency that processes more than 100 million gallons a year. So we're, 100 million gallons a day. So we continue to be very competitive. We see this as a regional advantage and one of the tools we can use to promote economic prosperity and economical development in the region. Next slide, please. Just digging in again with the five-year promise. It's helpful for our customers if they have a long-term outlook for what our rate increases are anticipating. So again, we have a 2% increase in 2021. 2022 and 2023, we're going to have to watch what happens. We still want to maintain our under 4% promise, but we'll need to see what happens in the region and what happens with the economy. It's a little tight on the budget to run at a 2% increase per year, but we also want to be sensitive to the needs of our customer community. So we will keep an eye on that. And in the long range, we're expecting to be at or below our inflation rate. We have some significant easing of our debt service rates in the late 2020s, around 2027, 2028. Our debt service bill gets much softer. So we should have some opportunities to keep our rates well within line in the long term. Next slide, please. So breaking down then into the specific uses by department and category. This is our operating budget at $166 million for the year. Want to emphasize that this does not include our debt service. Debt service for 2021 is going to be $157 million. So that's why this says 166 versus the higher numbers are shown earlier. So by department, you can see operations is obviously our biggest chunk. That's what it takes to run our 9 wastewater treatment plants, and then as well as maintenance is in there too. Administration is not just administration and finance, but it's also the services that we receive from RA from this regional administration. So that includes our HR and our finance and our rent. Probably actually not rent. Rent is individual units, but that's the support that we receive. Central services. Technical services looks low, but that's because we capitalize most of those employees' benefits and labor. So we only charged operations about 12% of tech services budget. The maintenance is there. Support services is our lab and our process improvement and our business systems groups under Larry Rogacki, and then EQA is Sam Paskey's water supply, water resource planning, water quality, and EQA. Looking at by a different slicing by category, you can see that salaries and benefits is our largest expense. And if you include debt service, it's second largest at 72. Debt service is about 48% of the total budget. Contracted services, that's where we get help from outside individuals and outside firms to help us with our things like program maintenance, security, and other contracted services. And then the rest of the components are there. Materials and supplies include our chemicals, as well as the ongoing tools that we need to run the business. RA allocation, again, is our centralized services there. Utilities, that's primarily gas and electric. And then other, and then of course more pay-go, pay-as-you-go is at 11 million, is about 6%. The important thing to know here is all of these pie charts would look very similar year over year, so no material shift in our expenses. Next slide, please. In terms of our sources, we like to emphasize that we are 100% fee for service. I like to say you flush, you pay, you don't flush, you don't pay. And that really does provide 92% of our operating fees and our operating source, particularly from municipal wastewater as well as industrial waste. SAC is not included in here because SAC pays entirely for debt service. So that's why you don't see it on this chart. But our other is primarily use of our reserves for rate relief, as well as any pass-through grants or pass-through allocations that we receive from either the state or from the council. And then, the green reserve would be from SAC reserve, and the purple reserve is from our operating reserve for rate relief. Next slide, please. Just a quick overview of our debt portfolio. You can see our debt is coming down. We peaked in 2018 at $1.36 billion. That's gonna come down, and that explains the debt bubble that we've talked about for a couple of years now. That is also easing, and by 2024, we'll actually see our debt service drop, as we will also see our debts, total debt, outstanding debt also. Again, I want to emphasize how excited we were to get 1.65% on 20-year fixed debt. That was $80 million of offering this spring. And then we're also continue to leverage and are grateful for our support from PFA, the Public Facilities Authority, which implements the SRFs, which is the State Revolving Fund, which is the federal assistance from the government, that gives us great interest rates there too. Typically around, not exactly the exact number from our last one and what we're expecting in the fall, but it's around 1.3 to 1.5% right now. So really affordable debt, and again, 20-year fixed. And just, I know we all see that interest rates are at record lows. It's often asked, have we considered refinancing? Yes, we do. Every year, we ask Springstead to take a look at our debt portfolio, and they evaluate if it makes sense for us to refinance. And generally it doesn't, and particularly this year it doesn't, mostly around closing costs and early payoff costs. So we do look at that, and again, right now we feel like the debt we have is the best we can do. Next slide, please. So 1.3 billion seems like a lot, but if you break it down by debt per capita, you can see we're in the lower quintile versus some other cities. People often ask, well, what's driving those larger debt rates? Most of those are consent decrees from the EPA, where the city agrees to make a certain amount of investment. And that's mostly because we are fortunate to have partnered with our our customer cities to have separated storm and sewer systems. So a lot of the consent decrees are because they have combined systems. So during a heavy rainfall or a heavy water event, you'll get overflows where they discharge sewage directly into the receiving water body. And usually there's two ways to fix it. You can either separate your sewers or you can build a giant underground tank. And by giant, the last one I visited was 26 feet across and 3 miles long and 300 feet under the ground. And they cost in the billions to build. Typically, most cities choose the underground storage for their consent decree. So a lot of cities here have those outstanding consent decrees where they have agreed to spend $3 to $5 billion over the next 10 to 20 years. So we are fortunate that in the 70s and 80s, we partnered with communities to separate. And really, it was the cities that did the yeoman's work there to separate their systems. So we do not face those consent decrees or combined overflows. And with that, that concludes our budget overview. I do want to put in a plug. Stay tuned for October when Janine Clancy comes in with our CIP and ACP, our capital program, and you'll see the long-term plans there. But for operating, this is all we have. And if there's any other questions, I would be happy to stand for those.
Thanks, Ned.
All right, thank you.
Okay, this is Wes Koistra. We'll begin the transportation budget. Before Heather and Ed walk through the slides, Nick and I will provide a high-level overview of the budget story. First, a statement of the obvious that we're in unprecedented times, and this 2021 budget carries the complete risk of these times. The transit budget and transit services face significant challenges and many unanswered questions for both the near and long term. I've been at Metro Transit for only about 18 months, but my colleagues who have worked at Metro Transit for years continue to tell me that they've never seen any situation like this or circumstances like this that are necessary for us to manage and overcome. For Metro Transit, it's not just the loss of 60 to 70% of our ridership with corresponding two-year reduction in fare revenues of $120 million. And it's not just the two-year loss of $90 million in MVEST revenues, but it's also multiple service adjustments that we've had to make over the last few months. It's the changes in service standards and other adaptations necessary for cleaning our publicly shared spaces, for achieving social distancing, keeping riders and operators as safe as possible, and doing this in alignment with public health guidelines. The list of 2020 changes and adaptations is significant. Daily cleaning and disinfecting of buses and rail cars, limiting rider capacity on bus, moving larger buses to our busiest routes and adding unscheduled trips to help keep the number of riders per bus down. Rear door boarding for some time for those who could, and now we've moved back to front door boarding in August. Requiring facial coverings for riders, installing barriers to separate riders from operators, temperature screening for employees, providing protective equipment to our operators, handing out masks to our riders. So far, we've handed out 50,000 masks, and we anticipate handing out 30,000 more masks in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And we've had to ask people not to ride. So these have been our priorities over the past months: to protect the health and safety of our riders and staff, and to provide the essential mobility service to people who rely on transit to get to work and to address their most fundamental needs, and to do the best we can to keep our staff employed. These will continue to be our priorities in the 2021 budget. Absent the CARES Act funding, we'd be telling an entirely different story. While the CARES Act funding is not enough by itself to cover all our lost revenues, the CARES Act grants, along with the available transit reserves and with a reduction of bus service to 80%, allows Metro Transit to present a budget with the intent of honoring these priorities through the end of the calendar year 2021. But again, if not for CARES Act funding, with only reserves and cost interventions, we'd run out of money by the end of this year, and we would not be able to honor these intents. Absent CARES Act funding, we could not hope to meet the service and health interests of our riders. we cannot hope to achieve continued employment for our many dedicated staff. And then I should also say a little bit more about the 80% service level assumption. 80% service levels are proposed not because we expect ridership to return to 80% of pre-COVID levels, but rather because this is the service level we believe is required to meet service demands while honoring social distancing guidance. Also, we will not be providing 80% service levels for all service types. For example, when we move to 80% levels next month in September, express service levels are still expected to run at 30 to 35% of pre-COVID levels. While core local, supporting local LRT, ABRT services will run between 90 and 100% of pre-COVID levels. This is in response to the variance in service demand that we are seeing and expecting across our system. It also represents our hope to ensure that individuals who rely most upon transit will receive a service frequency that meets their needs in a healthy way. If the pandemic environment changes, if there's a vaccine or other changes that allow ridership to recover, we hope that 80% service levels will accommodate those additional riders as the governor turns his dial to ease or lift restrictions. I have used the word hope intentionally. Our most difficult issue is that we don't have a clear picture of our future. We don't know when there will be relief from the pandemic. We don't know when and at what rate ridership will begin to recover. And we don't know what long-term impact the pandemic will have on the workforce, on teleworking, on events, on how public spaces are shared, and ultimately on our ridership recovery. We don't know how MVEST will perform against forecast. It is in this context that we think about equity, how equity is represented in a budget with unprecedented risk. Fundamentally, our budget represents our priorities. In June, as one of our initial equity action steps, I asked staff to start developing meaningful equity analysis for operating and capital improvement programs. While we've considered equity in budgets previously, and we are charged to do that and thrive in the Council's existing equity policy, what is new to this work is an effort to develop and keep a more deliberate and intentional approach. To that end, we are actively developing an approach to perform an equity analysis of the budget. We are also doing the same for our service planning process and the quarterly service changes as we make them. We are working to figure out what this should look like and how to make it meaningful. And by meaningful, I mean work that influences, an analysis that influences decisions. As Leslie Canderas shared at the Transportation Committee meeting on Monday, our future budget equity analysis will address at least three main components. The first is service levels that we fund through the budget. Providing transit in and of itself contributes to regional equity, and the amount of services funded by the 2021 budget and how the service is configured is significant to understanding the equity implications of our budget. We have about 45% of our riders are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. That's compared to 27% region-wide. 41% of our riders have household incomes less than $35,000 annually, and that's why 80% of service is not 80% of service everywhere. That's why we apply those services and apply the structure of our service plan to address the greatest needs in our region. The second element includes programs and initiatives designed to make transit service more accessible and equitable. The preliminary 2021 budget will support key programs including better bus stops, TAP, the HAT team. These are all programs you are familiar with. And at the last Transportation Committee, we reported on the expansion of TAP to include unemployed and those identified as refugee or seeking asylum, and the expansion of the Access Pass program for people receiving health care through medical assistance or receiving social services through counties. And the third element is the organizational practices that are critical to advancing equity. The budget also gives us a means to design our organizational practices in ways that embed and advance equity. Examples include public engagement, workforce diversity, maximizing DBE and MCUB opportunities, and also the work of our equity and inclusion team. So in close of my overview, it's important to again emphasize that this is a preliminary budget, and this preliminary transportation budget, more than any of the past preliminary budgets, will see significant change between now and when the December budget is adopted. Invest receipts will be different from forecasts. We will gain more experience with ridership and fare collections. We will continue to look at service level assumptions and costs, as well as the impact of spending restrictions we have in place right now within Metro Transit. Our operating budget will see changes prior to the public comment draft that will be passed, is expected to be passed in late October. And then again, there will be changes before the December final budget that comes after the November forecast. Recall, as was said earlier in the budget presentation, that the primary purpose of preliminary budget is to set maximum levies. The transportation operating budgets are not reliant on these levies, so any changes over the next 4 months will not have an impact on the levy decisions that need to be made later this month. So thanks for allowing time for the overview, and I'll pass it on to Nick Thompson.
Thank you, Wes. The MTS division includes 3 key areas. It's our planning group, grants and finance, and our contracted transit services. All 3 groups have different impacts in the budget that we're going to present today. It's our planning group that is really essentially the MPO staff for the council, managing long-range transportation planning, federal funding processes, which includes distribution of nearly $100 million in regional solicitation funds every year. And their budget is substantially funded with federal planning funds. Our grants and finance group, led by Heather, who will be giving the budget details, also is a group that we share with the Community Development Division, managing our large grant programs and division budgets. And finally, our contracted transit services group, which includes managing all the public transit services in the region that are operated by a contract with private transit operator. It is this group that manages our contracted fixed route service, our Transit Link, and Metro Mobility. The largest share of our division budget is from the contracted transit service group. And within that is a budget driven primarily by the Metro Mobility program, which until this year was seeing annual growth rates of 6% in ridership per year. I echo what Wes has said, expressing the impact of COVID on our budget, both this year and next year. Our budget faces the same pressures of MVEST and fares that were impacted by COVID that Metro Transit has. Along with, we have a dependency on state general funds for the Metro Mobility program, and we know, as everyone knows, the state is facing a very large projected budget deficit. Is going to put pressure on this general fund funding source that is key to Metro Mobility. Fortunately, our planning budget, which is reliable on this federal funding source, has not been too impacted by COVID. But like Metro Transit, our contracted transit service and budget have been deeply impacted. And we are presenting tonight a budget that has a lot of assumptions that could change dramatically with different outcomes of COVID. We've basically redesigned our transit services, contracted transit services, because of COVID to incorporate a safe system for customers and for drivers. And we've designed whole new models, including transporting of food from food shelves and groceries to customers rather than transporting people. So we've really completely redesigned that system. And we've needed that redesign both because it's safe for our customers and the need in the community, but it also has helped enable the viability of our contractors who have been impacted by COVID in terms of the services that we contracted with them. All these COVID impacts are large, and how they impact our budget and what our assumptions are. Our COVID transit services have very different cost structures when we're building our budget than what we're used to. These extra cleaning costs and social distancing requirements that we've implemented
result in very different costs per trip. And the typical ways we may have presented budget in the past where we use ridership changes as a proxy for budget changes are really being upended. A great examples of this is because of COVID, we are no longer providing shared rides currently on Metro Mobility or TransitLink in order to minimize contact between customers. And so this is a very different service model than a shared ride model, and it results in a very different cost model. Our budget this year is very highly variable, as Wes indicated, with Metro Transit's also, and we fully expect to go through many changes in the next coming months as we learn more about how our riders are returning and how the assumptions we will make on things like shared ride and food delivery that could easily change. We are matching our service level changes to what Metro Transit is in that 80% threshold. But like Metro Transit, we have differences based on where the contracted transit routes are, with express routes being much more impacted than maybe suburban local or urban local that we provide through contract. Our TransitLink service now is really primarily providing food delivery from food shelves to needed customers who need that in their region rather than transit trips. So that's something we will continue to watch. We fully expect there'll be a need to continue throughout the end of this year, and we'll have to build in assumptions about that in 2021, unless the economy or ridership comes back strong. Metro Mobility, because of its large impact on MTS budget, is the area we're watching very closely. Our Metro Mobility customers have definitely responded in our call to provide that they only use it and limit that to essential trips. And we've maintained that direction that they should only still be using that for essential trips. We do not know when we will lift that, but we do know that when we start to open up that service to more than just essential trips, those Metro Mobility customers will come back quickly because for many, this is their only form of transportation. Like Metro Transit, the CARES Act has been essential for us balancing our budget this year and next, as you'll see in the coming slides. CARES has allowed us to provide these essential services to meet the customer needs of, example, delivering food rather than making the customers travel to the grocery or food shelves. But it's also allowed us to keep our contractors viable businesses as we need them to be ready when that ridership and available when the ridership returns, and they've responded well. This preliminary budget represents our division priorities and a plan for our transportation future, but also sustaining the transit services through contracts that are essential to our quality of life and for our customers. And with that, I'll turn it over now to Ed Petrie and Heather Agassiz-Hubner to go through the transit budget details.
Thanks, Nick. I just want to interject first for a second, and I know we're running over 6 o'clock, and some of you have a hard stop. So this is just informational item. We're not voting, but it is really good background. And if you have to leave, we'll make sure we'll give you an opportunity to kind of get some of this more detailed information. And those that are willing to stay, we'll keep going. I know I've got a hard stop at 6:30, but let's keep going for those that are able to. Kind of gather this. This is important information. Sorry, thanks. Keep going.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Committee members, Ed Petrie, Director of Finance, Metro Transit. I'd like to thank Wes and Nick, and they presented a lot of our slides this evening, which is really good. So Heather and I will go through the slides as expedient as we can. So next slide. First of all, one of the things I just want to say, as we have talked about tonight, is that with the budget, with developing our budget, I kind of look at it, and just Heather and I have looked at this. This is not just a 2021 budget. We're actually rebalancing 2020 and establishing a 2021 budget because of all the uncertainty that we've had. We've had a lot of discussions with the Transportation Committee about how we're trying to rebalance 2020 and move into 2021. And one of the themes that you're going to hear tonight too is also that we have a very heavy reliance upon one-time funds, not only in 2020 but also in 2021. That includes the fortunate receipt of the CARES Act funds, but also our receipt or our use of our fund balance reserves that we had built over the years. The basis for the budget development, first of all, is the transportation policy plan. That sets all of our regional standards for our service. It identifies our regional route analysis, and pretty well that information based on the standards will also then allow us then to forecast what our revenue should be based on ridership, based on certain standards that we should be hitting. Some of the other things that are developed within our budget are the labor agreements with ATU, TMSA, the police, ASME, non-rept. You're very aware that we are right now in the middle of negotiations with the ATU, and our assumptions are built into the budget. The council does a fair policy review where we set our fair policy standards. These are regional standards that not only impact council operations, council transit service, but also regional providers, because we have a regional fair policy. And also then the introduction of the CARES Act funds. As you are aware, Heather will talk more about this, but the council did receive $226 million in CARES Act money. $12 million went to the regional providers through subrecipient grants. 214 stayed with council services. And we're planning to expend those funds in calendar year 20 and 21. Next slide. Policies and actions. First of all, one of the things that we do a lot of work on, Heather and I working with Stuart and Marie Henderson and Mary, we look very closely at our preliminary budget. We also make sure that we are in lockstep with all the forecasts and all the financial plans. When I'm talking forecasts, first of all, we have the motor vehicle sales tax forecast. We get state appropriations from the legislature for both Metro Mobility and for the rail lines. We look at that within our plans, but then we also do a multi-year financial plan. We call it the toolbox, but it's a multi-year financial plan where we not only look at the current year, but forecast us out for the next 2 bienniums thereafter. And with looking at all the different forecasts and identifying where we think we may have issues and or what potential solutions and our ideas we can use to solve our financial considerations and issues. One of the big things that we've talked about in the past, and we'll talk about tonight, is the fact is that we did have a structural deficit, and we still do have a structural deficit. As we discussed with you last year, we had forecast as of that point in time that we were going to hit our structural cliff, as we called it, about June or July of 2021. Because of receipt of the COVID money, the CARES Act money, we now feel that that financial cliff has been pushed out about 6 more months, but we're still looking at probably about a January of 2022 cliff that we will be hitting. The financial considerations, like I talked about in the budget, we have state general fund appropriation, which is based in law, the motor vehicle sales tax. We generally receive motor vehicle sales tax forecast in February and November. We generally base the budget on the preliminary budget based on February. Then when we get the November forecast, we will then update the budget before adoption in December. This year, because of the impacts of COVID and the impacts on the economy, the state of Minnesota did another forecast on May 4th of 2020. So the budget that we're presenting this evening is based upon the May 4th, 2020 MVES forecast. But once again, we should receive another one in November, which we will then use to update and talk to the Transportation Committee Management and Council before we adopt in December. And as we talked about the CARES Act, we've talked about our outlook. So next slide. This is a duplicate slide, so let's go to the next one. Okay, state general fund appropriation, as we talked about, it's appropriated by the legislature on a biennial basis. Per legislation, they must cover 50% of the net operating assistance for light rail, but that would exclude the Metro Green Line extension. The state general fund right now is on a pace to be consumed 100% by Metro Mobility operations in state fiscal year 2022. And so to maintain ongoing operations, we're going to need an additional increase in state general funding starting in state fiscal year 2022 to maintain the growth. One of the final points that's on this slide is about bus operations. As you will see in the presentation tonight, bus operations is reliant upon motor vehicle sales tax. State general funds goes entirely to Metro Mobility, light rail, and commuter rail. Next slide. The important thing about this slide is we discussed this last year is that with the last legislative session, one of the big things that happened was the legislature broke Metro Mobility and light rail out separately on the state appropriations. The council viewed this as a very, very strong and important point, is the fact is that the legislature recognized the growth in Metro Mobility. It is a federally mandated service. They recognize the growth and the importance of their need to continue to fund this service. So they did break it out separately, which we were very happy about. They also then provided us one-time funding in state fiscal years 20 and 21 of about $36 million. You can see we're using that in 20 and 21. The big piece on this slide, you will note though, starting in state fiscal year 22, which starts in July of 2021, is we go back to the base of about $56 to $57 million for Metro Mobility. So the one-time money that we received in the current biennium is gone in the next biennium. Next thing that's interesting on this slide is that you will notice that light rail has a base of $25.5 million, no recognition of inflation, a flat base. Commuter rail has a base budget of $7.1 million. Again, no recognition for inflation, a flat base. So this is one of the things that we will be talking a lot about moving forward into the upcoming legislative session next year, talking about state general fund appropriations and the need for more, not only for Metro Mobility, but for the rest of the light rail and commuter rail. Next slide. Motor vehicle sales tax, I've somewhat talked about this already. As we talked about, we do forecast this in February and November of each year. We did update it in May. One of the big important things here is that for over forecasting, we work with MnDOT, and whatever MnDOT is using for future forecasts outside of the state forecast, we forecast the same. The other big piece is the fact is that the council has chosen to budget. When we went up to motor vehicle sales tax in 2008, the council chose to budget only 95% of the state forecast. Anything up and above that would then go into a motor vehicle sales tax to be used for future operations in the next year. So because of the volatility, the council chose to only budget 95% of the state forecast, which was a very strong move by the council. Next slide. So tracking our financial outlook, as I already talked about this, we do a toolbox forecast for the current year and for the next two biennium for a 5-year period. And we look at the significant changes in motor vehicle sales tax, passenger fares, our one-time use of reserves. We're programming in the CARES Act money, which once again is one-time money. As Wes talked about, we're looking at our service levels. We're planning 80% service levels in 2021, starting actually in September of 2020, but moving into 2021. But we will be watching service. We're going to be watching overloads and really watching the economy and watching the region to see how our customers return to our service and then reevaluate our service loads. As we've talked about, we do have a pending financial cliff right now. Our forecast right now shows it's in January of 22. Next slide. Some of the COVID things that we've already talked about, I'll breeze through this slide quickly here, is some of the impacts that we've seen on COVID. First of all, some of the items that are increasing, we've had the $214 million of federal CARES Act money coming in, a high use of one-time use of reserves. So both of those are one-time fundings. And then we have additional overhead, cleaning, and COVID staff salaries to maintain and keep our vehicles, our rail cars, our stations, our platforms, and all of our facilities clean and sanitized. Decreasing stuff that we're seeing because of COVID is motor vehicle sales tax, as we've talked about, ridership, our service hours, we're adjusting down to 80% service, and we're also looking at consulting contracts and instituting some administrative reductions. Next slide. Kind of the big thing on this whole slide is basically the first bullet point. With this budget, we're trying to make safe and conservative assumptions based on what we do not know. This is for a finance person, this is very difficult, trying to budget, trying to forecast based upon parameters that we know nothing about. So as we talked about, this is a 2-year balancing act, 2020 and 2021. Fortunately, we had CARES Act money and excess available reserves to use. Next slide.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So this is going to be our transition point. I'm doing a quick time check. I see it 6:15, so I am going to fly through these next slides to try and preserve some time for questions. And I'm happy to circle around on anything that you feel I've glossed over too quickly. So we've talked about the CARES Act, right? So I'm going to just give you the summary and then fly through the slides. So we got about $226 million. We got that money based on a federal formula, and we then applied the federal formula regionally. Could you go to the next slide, please? So when you apply that federal formula locally, it goes to all the regional providers, including the suburban transit providers and ourselves. Next slide, please. Once the council had our portion, we had to look at how are we going to allocate it across the council services. Our first cut was by lost revenue. And then the second cut was, then we programmed it based on lost revenue and then to make all the programs whole. What that looks like in the preliminary budget is that it is nearly similar to this formula distribution with a couple small exceptions. One of those is Metro Mobility in the preliminary budget was $3 or $4 million short. So we plugged that hole with Federal CARES Act, and that may change as we go through and bring the public comment and final budget to you. Next slide, please. So the reason we distributed the money this way is, one, we wanted to follow federal rules and the intent of the rules as much as possible, make it easy for us to understand, make it easier for our stakeholders and our partners to understand. Next slide, please. So when we do the budget, we budget really at a discrete line item and then roll it up to you. We have really tight parameters. We apply policy, we apply appropriations, we apply forecasts. Basically, where there is a foundation, we always go to this. Ed made a comment in the Transportation Committee that as budget people, we like to come to you with solid foundations always, and we always do the best. This was a really hard year to do that. So what this slide does, I'm not going to go through everything because Wes and Nick and others have covered it, but this is the assumptions that we're going with now. We're keeping a really close eye on these things, and we'll adjust as we need to throughout the year. Next slide, please. We know we have some volatile funding sources, including MVEST. Just know, I think everybody has mentioned, or other folks have mentioned today, that we understand that some of our funding sources are volatile, and we do a lot of work within our budget to mitigate those so that we can really weather the bumps as much as we can. That includes only programming 95% of our MVEST the first year. Metro Transit does fuel hedging, so that basically means we can eliminate the ups and downs. They basically know what about 90% of their fuel contracts are going to look like. And the Federal CARES Act has really, to be quite honest, like really kind of saved our budget, both in 2020 and 21. And we also have operating fund reserve targets, and we've been building those, and those are also saving us in our 20 and 21 budget. All this kind of prudent financial planning we've been doing is really paying dividends this year to help us weather this as best as we can. Next slide, please. Okay, so Metro Mobility, we called it out in particular for all the reasons that Ed talked about with the state general fund appropriation. So I'm not going to belabor that other than to say, but for COVID, we continued to have rising ridership there, and that puts pressure on both our operating and capital budgets. Next slide, please. Okay, the next two slides are hard to look at. It is really showing what happens, the adjustments that we have had to make based on our ridership. So if you look at the Metro Transit ridership and you see the really deep dip that it took in 20 and 21, that is for COVID. And if you slide to the next slide, please, you're going to see a very similar chart. One of the things I will note is you will see a little stronger uptick in the contracted services ridership, and that's really because we think Metro Mobility is likely to come back faster than our base ridership. Next slide, please. This is a slide where I was going to talk about equity, and Wes and Nick talked about that a little bit more. So I guess I don't feel like I can do this justice in a 1 to 2 minute snippet, so we can certainly come back and talk about this more. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So taken all together, our preliminary budget, $615 million, and about half of this is bus service, and that's represented either by the Metro Transit slice bus, which is red, and or kind of the light blue contracted services that just sits adjacent to that. Light rail and Metro Mobility each comprise about 15% of our budget, and the remainder of the budget supports commuter rail, transit capital, and planning. As you can look on the right, salaries and benefits make up nearly 60% of the budget and contracted services is about 134. You're going to see a lot of the Metro Transit staff showing up in that lighter blue. And with MTS, when our biggest cost is our contracted services, because that is how we do our service model, we're showing up to a greater extent in that darker blue. Next slide, please. From a funding perspective, I'm going to hammer this home one more time. We have a really high use of one-time funds to get us through 2021. We're basically leveraging all the motor vehicle sales tax reserves we have. We are leveraging the Federal CARES Act. It is good because it gets us through the end of calendar year 21, but that fiscal cliff really remains in 22. So what I want to do is I just want to note that there is one more slide after this that Marie is going to cover, and history has taught me we're not always great and disciplined about getting back to that. So I will pause to see if anyone has any questions that Ed and I might be able to answer. Otherwise, if you can all help me be accountable and make sure we get to that last slide with Marie.
Okay, Marie.
So, Mr. Chair and council members, in the beginning, I told you that this is a very long presentation, but very important. So this is our presentation of our preliminary 2021 Unified Operating Budget and Levy that we are proposing here today. We will be back next meeting, August 26th, and be asking you to adopt this operating budget and levy. And with that, that concludes our presentation. Understanding that we have limited time for questions, but we are open to those. So thank you.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you. There's so many presenters. I won't name you all because that would take all of our remaining time, but honestly, it just shows the depth and the breadth of all of our operations. It's fair to say that this PowerPoint will be available to council members in the next couple of weeks so we can kind of get a chance to review it, and we do want to be able to be responsive to questions beyond our limited time. Any questions? So this is just we're not acting now, but we will be acting in the future. So it's important we keep our eyes open on this preliminary budget. Well, you've all been really patient. Mary, thank you, for and your team for presenting this. I know I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is thank council members and a lot of this, of course, going through committees, but it's really important to see it as a whole. I had just two quick reports. One is those that are reading the newspapers or watching TV, we had a couple of big items in the past. It was not a quiet week in Lake Wobegon. We have shifted our alignment along the Bono line, and thank you, council members who are engaging in that process. We have a corridor meeting tomorrow. And then the full funding agreement has been advanced to Capitol Hill and Washington for a mandatory 30-day review. That is no guarantee that it's signed. We're very nervous, but we're full of great expectation that the administration will make the final commitment for the $1 billion towards Southwest Light Rail. That is really important step for all of us. I think the themes about fiscal cliffs, one-time funding, volatility of revenue, these are really important things for us to kind of keep our eyes on, and we'll want to give enough time for us to kind of understand where the issues are, and I know we, as they say, it's a lofty challenge for all of us. I just want to say quick other things. One is Mary, as acting regional counsel, Molly Cummings as the vice chair, and I are going to be kind of doing individual check-ins with all council members, kind of talk how things are going, what we think is going well, what we think is not going well, what you think is going well, what you'd like to see improved, just as how we are acting as a council. So I want to just give you a heads up on that. Having said that, does anybody else have a quick, any comments, reports? Mary, do you have anything?
No, Mr. Chair, good to go.
General Counsel, who I passed over this last meeting, she did have a report, and I just closed things up so quickly. Anne, you're here somewhere.
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. Real quickly here, the last 2 weeks in July, the Office of General Counsel had a first-year law clerk from the Twin Cities Diversity and Practice 1L rotation clerkship. Twin Cities Diversity and Practice is an organization that promotes diversity in legal practice in Minnesota, and the first-year program is partnerships between law firms and corporate or government clients. We were the only government entity that participated. We partnered with the Lockridge Grindle law firm. So Yura Chang from the University of Minnesota was with Lockridge for most of the summer, but then did 2 weeks with us, and we really just tried to cram as much public sector law experience as we could into those 2 weeks for her. So I think it's a really important program. We were really excited to participate in it, and I just wanted the council members to know about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Well, unless there's any concern or objection, I want to thank everybody for keeping close attention on this budget. There is certainly time the next couple of weeks to drill in deeper for anybody who's interested. And then in the meantime, I look forward to seeing all of you soon, one place or another. Enjoy the evening. It stopped raining while we've been meeting, so at least where I am. And enjoy the evening. We'll see you soon. This meeting is adjourned. Thanks. Bye-bye. Thank you.